The rain was falling heavily, pounding against the windows of the old house on a secluded street far from the city. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as if the very environment were in tune with what was happening inside the house. Inside, a 10-year-old girl was hidden in the dark corner of her room, her eyes fixed on the screen of her phone, her heart racing. She didn't know if she had the courage, but she knew she couldn't take it anymore. Downstairs, the sound of her father's footsteps echoed up the stairs. He always did this, walking slowly, as if he had control over everything, as if he knew she wouldn't run away. But she no longer feared his threats. Fear had turned into anger, into an overwhelming desire to escape. Her name was Emily, and she was living in a constant nightmare. Since she was 7 years old, when Emily's mother had died in a car accident, things began to change. Her father, Daniel, had always been a calm, seemingly kind man, but the pain of the loss had affected him in unexpected ways. Little by little, he changed, and what once seemed like a loving father became a monster. Emily, scared and alone, didn't know how to ask for help. Up until that point, she hadn't found the strength to tell anyone about what was happening in the basement. But now she knew it was time to act. The phone was in her hands, her finger trembling over the emergency number. She knew that if she made the call, there would be no turning back. Her father would be arrested, but at the same time, she knew he would do anything to get revenge. He always had. Her eyes locked on the screen, hesitating. This wasn't the first time she thought about calling the police, but there had always been an excuse not to. Now, the anger and pain were stronger. With a deep breath, Emily pressed the numbers 911. The sound of the phone ringing for the operator seemed deafening. She took another deep breath, trying to control the panic. 911, what's your emergency? Said a calm yet urgent female voice. Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight, but the words came out of her mouth, quiet and shaky. My dad, he does horrible things to me. In the basement. The operator was silent for a moment, as if trying to process the girl's words. Where are you right now? The voice asked, now firm, yet still calm and clear. In my room, at the house on Oakwood Drive. Hurry, please, he'll find me. He always finds me. Emily could hear her own teeth chattering. The pressure in her head was unbearable. She turned to look at the door of her room, which was ajar. Every sound seemed amplified in that silent house. She knew that if she didn't act now, it would be too late. She knew something terrible was about to happen. The operator, sensing the gravity of the situation, began asking quick, precise questions. Emily answered as clearly as she could, but couldn't stop her anxiety. The sound of heavy footsteps climbed the stairs again. Her father was getting closer. She crouched in the corner, trying to make as little noise as possible. The tension was palpable. Emily knew that if he found her right now, there would be no escape. But something inside her had changed. She wasn't going to hide anymore. The last thing Emily heard before hanging up the phone was the operator's voice, telling her that the police were on their way. This was no longer about being saved. It was about surviving. She knew the revenge would come, but she also knew that once the police arrived, there was nothing her father could do anymore. He could no longer control her. Emily had never really known when the change had happened. There wasn't a single day she could point to and say, this is when he became someone else. The house, once full of laughter and conversation, now felt like a silent prison, the weight of loneliness dragging through the halls. She clearly remembered the mornings of the past, when her dad would wake her up with a smile, asking how she had slept, making her breakfast. He had always been a present, dedicated man until the tragedy happened. But little by little, Daniel had withdrawn, burying himself in his own shadows. After her mother's accident, Emily felt like she was losing more than just the woman who brought her into the world. She was also losing the man she had known as her father. Without her mother to calm them, the house became more and more silent, like a storm about to explode. He began going out late at night, drinking too much, getting upset over small things. Emily didn't understand, but she felt the distance, the coldness, the fear that took over the house as the days passed. It was one night when Emily was just beginning to understand what was really happening that the first incident of abuse occurred. That night, he sent her to the basement, claiming he wanted to teach her to be more obedient. She didn't know what to expect, but when he locked her down there and did that to her, Emily knew deep in her soul that something irreparable was happening, something she could never erase. Over time, Daniel's behavior became increasingly unpredictable. Sometimes he seemed almost human, apologizing and crying for his actions, saying he didn't want to be the monster she thought he was. But just like his promises to change, the moments of kindness were fleeting as well. With each passing day, he sank deeper into his own weaknesses and violence. It wasn't just the physical abuse, but also the psychological control. He kept her isolated from the world outside, telling her no one would believe her, that no one would understand her. The school teachers noticed Emily's isolation, but the girl knew what would happen if anyone tried to intervene. Her father had a cunning way of manipulating people. He always appeared to be the perfect man in front of others, the loving father, the devoted widower. He knew how to hide his true face, always shifting the blame onto Emily when she was about to tell someone about the terrible things he did. The house, once a place of comfort, had transformed into the only place where she felt safe, but at the same time, it was the only place she knew there was no escape. The dark, damp basement was the territory where the rules of the world twisted. Emily knew she was being watched, monitored, and that any wrong move could mean more pain. She had learned to be invisible, to walk without making a sound, to stay quiet. But the fear she felt now was no longer the same. The fear that once made her tremble in silence had turned into an unstoppable force. She didn't want to be the victim anymore. Daniel, on the other hand, continued his routine of attempts at control. As the days dragged on, he tried to manipulate situations so Emily would believe that what was happening wasn't wrong. "You're my daughter. You belong to me," he would often say. He believed that somehow he had the right to do what he was doing. The distorted concept of love he tried to pass on to Emily was based on guilt and dominance, not care or affection. He wanted her to depend on him for everything, even for living. But deep down, Daniel also had his own ghosts. He wasn't just dealing with the pain of losing his wife, but also with his own inner demons, which he had never sought to face. The temptations of his twisted mind were a way to deal with the emptiness he felt. Emily, though she tried to understand, knew she could never put herself in his place. She saw her father no longer as a man, but as a shadow of what he had once been. However, everything was about to change. The phone was off, but the feeling of freedom and revenge began to take shape in Emily's mind. She wasn't going to wait anymore. She was no longer willing to be the target of his anger. She had a plan. She didn't know exactly what would happen after calling the police, but something inside her told her that once the call was made, there would be no going back. She was ready to fight for her life. Revenge wouldn't come in the form of violence, but in courage. Emily knew that the only way to survive was to get rid of Daniel once and for all. Whatever happened next, she felt empowered by the simple fact of having taken the first step. Emily now heard her father's footsteps with an alarming clarity. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a warning, a siren that she wasn't safe yet. The phone in her hand was cold, and the screen, lit only by the dim light coming through the window, seemed like a promise of freedom. But at the same time, it was the thin line between life and death. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew she couldn't turn back. The phone was off, but she felt the urgency in her body. The sound of Daniel's footsteps echoed like a weight on her shoulders, threatening to crush her with every passing second. Emily swallowed hard. She was so close, but he knew that too. He always knew. With one last breath, Emily pressed the call button again. The phone rang, and she felt a growing agitation in her throat. But just before the operator could answer, the sound of something hitting the floor made her heart stop. The bedroom door slowly opened, and there was Daniel, his eyes glazed, and a sadistic smile she knew all too well. "What are you doing, Emily?" Daniel's voice was low and controlled, but there was a coldness she couldn't ignore. He was walking toward her slowly, but his eyes were fixed on the phone she was trying to hide. "Nothing, Daddy. Just looking at something." Emily forced a smile, trying to hide the growing panic in her chest. But he wasn't a fool. He knew something was wrong. He walked up to her, and the fear of being caught made her shrink back. Daniel's fingers reached out, and with a quick motion, he snatched the phone from her hands. He glanced quickly at the screen. "You called the police?" he asked, his voice now full of rage. Emily didn't answer, her body tense, but her eyes couldn't hide the hatred that was growing inside her. When he got even closer, she felt an adrenaline like never before. The anger began to overtake her, stronger than the fear. He was about to scream when the sound of a distant siren cut through the air. The noise of the approaching police was like a lightning bolt, illuminating the darkness that seemed to surround her. The pain of knowing he might escape once again, but now with a limited path, left her with a single desire: revenge. Daniel stared at her, and the fury in his eyes made Emily feel the heat of justice finally closing in. He could no longer manipulate her, not anymore. "You'll pay for this. You will pay," he muttered, almost as a promise. But at that moment, the sound of the police sirens was nearly deafening, growing louder by the second. Emily knew she had little time left. She glanced at her father, the man she had once called a hero, now reduced to a shadow of what he had been. His hand still gripped the door to the room, but the expression on his face told her that he knew the tide had turned. The house seemed small now. The lights from the sirens reflected in the windows, entering as if they were part of the judgment he deserved. Emily felt her throat tighten, but she didn't let fear take over. She had done it. The police were here. He wasn't going to escape. But before she could move, a voice from across the house called her name. "Emily!" It was him, Daniel. He was in panic, but also filled with uncontrollable rage. She stood up, still tense, knowing that the next hour would be decisive. From across the house, the sound of doors being kicked in and the voices of the police hit her like a wave. The tension exploded all at once, and she ran to the hallway, trying to find an exit. Daniel, no matter how strong or manipulative he had been, knew his time had come. Reaching the end of the hallway, she saw what had always been a prison, the basement, the place where her life had shattered. But now, it didn't seem like a place of fear anymore. It was a reminder. He could no longer hold her captive with his lies. He had no more control. Emily turned to face the man who, for so many years, had manipulated, tortured, and tried to destroy her. What she saw now was just a weak man, a powerless man, in the face of what was about to happen. She no longer feared him. When the police finally reached her, Emily looked at her father's face. He still tried to appear strong, but something in his gaze revealed that he knew. His mask was about to fall, and he had no place left to hide. Emily's revenge was about to be completed, and it wasn't through physical violence. It was the pain of losing control, the pain of knowing his daughter had finally broken free. The tension in the house grew with every second, but Emily couldn't stop staring at what was about to happen. The arrival of the police was only the beginning, but the weight of the situation consumed her from the inside out. She had done the impossible. She had called 911, exposed the monster her father had become. But now, with the police on his heels, the feeling that everything was about to crumble was almost tangible. As the officers stormed the house, Emily felt Daniel's gaze fixed on her. He didn't say anything. His face was red with anger and frustration, but the fragility that now showed in him was almost unrecognizable. He had always portrayed himself as the strong man, the provider, the pillar of the house. But here, before the police, he was just a broken man, with no more lies to tell. Daniel's first reaction was to try and deny everything. He screamed, claiming that Emily was confused, that she was making everything up. He had always had this ability to manipulate the truth, to distort facts, to protect himself. But the police were no longer willing to listen to his stories. There was evidence. There were proofs. And the most important one was Emily's courage to finally face the reality. But for Emily, the evidence wasn't just physical. It was in the invisible scars he had left behind, those that even the police couldn't see. Every silent look, every unspoken word was a mark left by her father. The psychological terror he had imposed on her for years couldn't be described in police reports, but Emily knew the moment of justice had arrived. The rage and pain she felt now were more than enough to keep her strong. The pain of losing her mother hadn't been overcome, but her death had become a distant memory in the face of the brutality her father had imposed. He had pushed her away from the world, isolated her, and the cruelest part of it all, he had done it under the guise of love. The feeling of betrayal she felt now was overwhelming. It wasn't just the pain of a father who had physically abused her, but the pain of realizing that the man she had loved had turned into something monstrous, someone who no longer deserved her forgiveness. However, Emily knew her journey wasn't over. The police were there to take her father away, but she felt that the real confrontation was only beginning. Daniel, now consumed by rage, tried to approach Emily, but she stepped back. He no longer had power over her. Never again. "Don't think it's over, Emily. I'm going to destroy you." Daniel screamed, his voice full of venom. He was lost, and he knew it. He was being taken by the hands of justice, but his mind still clung to one last attempt at control. He was no longer fighting for his past, but for the only thing left to him, power over his daughter. The police handcuffed him, and the expression on Emily's face, which had once shown fear and pain, was now overtaken by a deep sense of emptiness. She was free, but the reality was different from what she had imagined. The revenge she had sought was only part of the answer. She knew the emotional weight of it all would be hard to bear, but something inside her told her she would survive. She had already survived the worst part. As the officers led Daniel to the car, Emily stood still, watching every movement. The officers tried to console her, but she waved them off with a gesture of her hand. They were doing their job, but there was nothing they could do to erase the suffering she carried. But there was another issue at play. Emily still didn't know how all of this would affect her in the long run. The revenge, although necessary, wouldn't erase the years of suffering she had lived through. She felt as if part of herself had been torn away, as though who she had been before all this was irreparably broken. She didn't know what the future would bring. How would she cope with the days ahead, knowing her father would be in prison, but the damage had already been done? There was the matter of her recovery, the support she would need to rebuild her life. She couldn't do it all on her own. The feeling of loss and trauma would continue to follow her, but there was a growing strength inside her, something that made her believe she could, indeed, turn things around. She had her freedom now. And from that moment on, she had the choice to move forward, to fight for her mental and emotional health. The following days would be crucial. Her father's trial was scheduled for soon, and Emily knew she would be called to testify against him. The thought of speaking again about the horrors he had committed froze her in place, but at the same time, she knew this was part of her liberation. She could no longer hide. She was no longer the girl sitting in the corner of the room, waiting for the storm to pass. She was a woman now, with a truth to be told and a life to rebuild. The trial of Daniel began with palpable tension. Emily knew she was about to relive every dark moment she had tried so hard to forget. She had faced the terror in the basement and survived, but now she faced a new kind of terror, the weight of the truth. She sat at the table in the courtroom, watching the man who had once been her father, now reduced to a defendant. He was there, head down, eyes avoiding hers, but still, she could feel his presence, a dark force that haunted her even in the courtroom. The first surprise came early. Daniel's defense, represented by a renowned lawyer, argued that the alleged abuses had never occurred. They claimed that Emily had psychological issues, that her memory might be distorted, and that the events she described were inventions of a traumatized mind. Daniel, with a look of disgust, remained silent, but the victorious smile on his lawyer's face made Emily's blood boil. The lie he continued to weave was like a sharp blade cutting through her hope. But it wasn't Daniel's defense that worried her. It was something else, something she hadn't anticipated. During Emily's testimony, her body trembled and the words left her mouth with difficulty. She relived every pain, every act of violence. But then, something unexpected happened. In the middle of her narrative, she noticed a figure sitting in the shadows of the courtroom, almost invisible. Her eyes, trained to read her surroundings, detected the presence of a woman, someone she didn't know, but who was watching her closely. The woman was sitting in the back row, head down, wearing a black jacket, but her gaze was fixed on Emily. Something in that expression made Emily feel uncomfortable, as if that woman knew something about her that no one else did. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't look away. What did this woman want? The judge, interrupting her thoughts, asked her to continue. Emily tried to focus on her story, but a strange feeling washed over her. Something wasn't right. Something didn't add up. It wasn't until she finished her testimony and left the courthouse that the woman appeared again, this time at the exit, waiting for her. Emily stopped, unsure of what to do. The woman approached her with a calm voice, almost gentle, but with a sense of urgency. "Emily, can I talk to you?" she said with a slight smile, but her eyes were serious, as if about to reveal something important. Emily remained silent, watching the woman with distrust. She seemed to know her name, but Emily couldn't understand from where. Her heart began to race. "I know what you're going through. I know everything." The woman continued, not caring about the looks around her. "Your father. He's not the only one to blame." The woman's words hit Emily like a cold splash of water. She felt her stomach churn, and for a moment she couldn't respond. What did she mean, not the only one to blame? Who else was involved? Who could have helped her father? The woman, noticing her reaction, stepped forward and spoke more firmly. "I'm part of a group that investigates cases like yours. But there's more, Emily. Your father has much bigger connections than you realize. He didn't act alone." The woman leaned in closer and whispered, "You're not alone. And more importantly, you don't know everything he's done. He's just a piece of something much bigger, something that could destroy you if you're not careful." Still dazed, Emily looked at her, unsure whether to believe her or not. But there was something in her posture that made Emily think the woman was telling the truth, something she couldn't ignore. "How do you know that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling but filled with a desperate need for answers. The woman smiled faintly, but the expression on her face was dark. "Because I was one of the victims too, Emily. I know what your father is capable of, and I know how he manipulates the people around him. But he's not in control anymore. It's time for you to take the reins of your own story." The woman's revelation hit Emily deeply. All this time, she had believed Daniel acted alone, that he was the isolated monster in her life. But now, she was beginning to understand that he was part of something much more sinister, a power game that involved more people, more lies, more victims. Before she could ask more, the woman stepped back, leaving one final message. "They'll try to silence you, but you must keep going. Don't stop now." Emily stood frozen for a moment, processing everything she had just heard. What she had known about her father was nothing compared to the truth that was now starting to unfold. The man she thought she knew, the figure who represented all her suffering, was far from a simple, isolated monster. He was part of something much bigger. And now, Emily had more than just revenge on her mind. She had a mission that would take her far beyond the courtroom, to something deeper and more dangerous. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, but for the other victims, the ones who hadn't been heard. What she would do next wouldn't just be a confrontation with her father, but a battle against a system of abuse that stretched far beyond her own pain. The woman's revelation, right as she was leaving the courthouse, marked the beginning of a new and frightening phase for Emily. What had seemed like the end of her nightmare with her father was quickly turning into a new one. Now, what was at stake wasn't just the justice she had sought, but the safety of others, maybe even her own. What she thought she knew about Daniel's past and the network of abuse he had perpetuated was only just beginning to unfold. There was something much deeper and more threatening than she had imagined. In the following days, the pressure on Emily increased. She became a target, not just for the media, but also for those with a personal stake in the story. The anonymous phone calls began, the first warning that she had touched a sensitive point, a dark and neglected area. With each threatening voicemail, she felt more vulnerable, but her determination to continue the fight did not lessen. However, the biggest surprise came from within her own home. Even though Daniel was in prison, the effects of his presence continued to echo. What Emily didn't know was that inside the prison, her father was preparing a move that could reverse everything she had achieved. During a meeting with his lawyer, Daniel mentioned something Emily had never imagined. He had resources, powerful connections with influential people in the city and beyond. He wasn't as vulnerable as he appeared. In addition, there were the other members of the network the woman had mentioned. It wasn't just Daniel's abuse that had stretched over decades. There were other men, other women, maybe even public figures who were connected to Daniel's crimes. The threat now was bigger, and Emily knew that if she wanted to continue, she would have to uncover and dismantle this network, a nearly impossible task for someone who had already been a victim. But the mysterious woman who had warned her about this seemed to be right. She wasn't alone. The police, although they had started investigating Daniel's connections, were moving cautiously. Evidence was still being collected, and Daniel's resistance, both inside and outside the prison, complicated the process. Emily felt that with every move she made, Daniel's protective network closed in tighter, as if the system itself were subtly trying to silence her. At home, Emily began to discover something new within herself, a will to continue, an impulse that came from the depths of her being. She didn't want to be just a victim. She didn't want to be remembered as the girl who went through all of that and stayed quiet. She wasn't going to let her life be defined by her father's brutality or the shadow of everything he caused. Now, she had something more to defend: the truth. She knew the road ahead would be treacherous, but her mind was firmer than ever. However, not everyone around her saw things the same way. Sarah, her closest friend, though supportive, was starting to worry. She knew the investigation was getting more complex, and the dangers to Emily were increasing. One night, while they were talking on the couch at Emily's house, Sarah looked at her with a concerned expression. "Emily, I think you need to stop trying to do this alone. It's not just your father anymore. She looked around as if afraid someone was listening. "They know what you're doing. You might be putting your life at risk." Emily, her eyes fixed, replied calmly, but with a firmness Sarah didn't expect. "I can't stop. Not now, not after everything I've discovered. I know it's getting dangerous, but what am I supposed to do, Sarah? Let everything go silent again? They'll keep going. I'm going to keep going." The tension between them grew. Sarah, who had always been her support, now felt powerless. She knew what Emily had gone through, and her loyalty was unquestionable, but she also knew how much it was affecting her. Emily was becoming obsessed with the idea of seeking justice, even revenge. Sarah feared for her safety, but more than that, she feared for Emily's mental health. The quest for justice was becoming an obsession that was consuming her. Meanwhile, the investigation was slowly progressing. Daniel was being interrogated, but he hadn't revealed much yet. His time in prison was proving to be fertile ground for more manipulation. Even without full control, he still had allies working to cover up his actions. Emily knew the battle was far from over, and the forces against her were only just starting to move. In her loneliest moments, Emily thought about her mother. She remembered how her mother had seemed to be the only source of love and security in her life, the only one who believed in her, even in the darkest times. But her mother was dead now, and Emily was alone but stronger, more determined to do whatever it took to dismantle the network her father had built. Even behind bars, Daniel was still manipulating the pieces, but Emily now knew the fight was beyond what she had imagined. She wasn't just fighting him, she was fighting against a system of oppression, manipulation, and abuse that extended far beyond the walls of her home. And she was willing to face it, even if it meant putting herself in danger. What she had discovered was not just about her survival, it was about bringing the whole truth to light, dismantling the entire lie. The pressure on Emily kept building. Each day she dug deeper into the dark details of the abusive network Daniel had built. But with every step, the risk increased. Threatening phone calls became more frequent, and she felt a sense of being watched, as if every move she made was being observed. It wasn't just the memory of the atrocities her father had committed that haunted her now. It was the weight of responsibility. She knew she was risking her own life, yet she couldn't stop. The mysterious woman was right. There were more victims, more stories that needed to be heard. Meanwhile, Daniel's lawyer, a shrewd and calculating man, was orchestrating a counterattack. He knew the only way to slow the process and protect his client was to discredit Emily. He began casting doubt on her sanity, calling witnesses who claimed Emily had distorted fantasies, that her memory was compromised by trauma. Even with all the evidence against Daniel, the manipulation game was still in play. The legal system, always so bureaucratic, was allowing him to play his defense cards, trying to drag the case out for months. But what no one knew was that the lawyer had more in mind than just saving his client. Emily was no longer alone in this journey. Sarah, her longtime friend, had become more involved than she had ever imagined. Initially, Sarah had been a supportive presence, someone Emily could count on. But over time, Emily began to realize that Sarah was more committed to the success of her mission than to Emily's safety. It wasn't that Sarah didn't care about her. On the contrary, she wanted to protect her at all costs. But as the case intensified, Sarah seemed more and more absorbed by the game of power and revenge. Emily began to question whether, for Sarah, justice was still more important than her own survival. One night, while they were working together at home, Emily noticed that Sarah seemed distant, as if her mind was elsewhere. Her words were rushed, almost impatient. "Emily, you have to understand. Time is against us. If we don't act fast, all of this will disappear. Your father has power, he has connections, and the court is starting to lose track of the case. We need to be quick, we have to be quick before the evidence disappears." Emily looked at her, hesitating. Something was wrong. Sarah's focus was shifting. What had once seemed like a genuine concern for Emily's safety now sounded like a desperate urgency for revenge. But it was a revenge that no longer seemed about justice, but about destroying her father at any cost, even if it meant playing his game. Emily wasn't so sure anymore that her friend, despite her loyalty, was making the right choices. Sarah noticed Emily's look and immediately tried to justify her stance. "I know you think I'm being insensitive, but I'm just saying what's gotta be done. We can't wait any longer, Emily. You have no idea what's at stake here. I don't want you to get lost in the process. We're at the breaking point. If we're not relentless, we'll lose." Those words hung in the air, and Emily didn't know how to respond. She felt torn. She wanted justice, but she also wanted to understand what the true cost of this quest for revenge was. The line between justice and revenge was thin, and as time passed, it seemed that line was becoming harder and harder to distinguish. Meanwhile, Daniel was still in prison, awaiting trial, but his presence still loomed over everything. Emily began to realize that behind the iron bars, Daniel was subtly manipulating events. He had begun creating a network of influences, people willing to interfere with his defense, even from the outside. Even though he was incarcerated, he still had considerable control over the people around him, including some officers and even other prisoners. Emily knew that in order to finally take down the network he had formed, she needed to go beyond the system's limits. She needed to do something that would destabilize his influence. It was when she started investigating a new set of clues. During her investigation into Daniel's past, she came across old records of financial transactions that didn't make sense. They were payments, transfers, something that seemed to indicate a network of corruption far larger than she had imagined. These records led her to a name, a powerful public figure who had been associated with her father's past but who had never been investigated. The name was starting to make sense. It was a key piece in the entire puzzle. But what she didn't know was that by digging deeper, she would be stepping into very dangerous territory. This new name could be the key to taking down Daniel and everyone involved in his crimes. But it also meant a direct threat to her safety. As Emily got closer to this lead, the anonymous phone calls became more threatening and the surveillance on her intensified. The risk was growing greater with each passing day, and the people around her were changing. Sarah was becoming more and more fixated on the idea of destroying what was left of Daniel, regardless of the means, and Emily began to wonder if she could still trust her. She was no longer sure of anything. The pressure was building like a storm about to explode. Emily knew the game was getting more dangerous, but she hadn't fully grasped the extent of what was about to happen. The investigation into the name she had found in the financial transactions was leading her into forbidden territory, a web of corruption that didn't only involve Daniel, but several powerful figures in the city, including some of the biggest names in local politics. More and more she realized that Daniel wasn't the only guilty party, but a piece of something much bigger, something she couldn't control. Then came the turning point. Sarah was being pressured by the very consequences of her actions. Although she was still dedicated to the cause, she was becoming increasingly impatient and obsessed with the idea of destroying Daniel without thinking about the consequences for herself or for Emily. Over the weeks, she had distanced herself from Emily, treating her more as a partner in a power struggle than as a friend. But the worst was yet to come. The night Emily decided to move forward with her discoveries and confront the name of one of the people involved, she was taken by surprise by an unexpected visit. Sarah showed up at her door, visibly shaken. Her eyes were red, and there was an air of tension on her face that Emily had never seen before. Something was wrong. "Emily, we need to talk," Sarah said, trying to control her breath, but the words came out hurriedly. "I've done something. I made a mistake." Emily furrowed her brow, suspicious. This wasn't how Sarah acted. She knew her well enough to realize that her friend was hiding something, but what made her more uncomfortable was the expression of guilt that dominated her face. "What happened?" Emily asked, her voice firm, but with a tone of concern. Sarah hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. She took a deep breath before looking directly at Emily. I contacted Daniel's lawyer." Sarah's words hung heavily in the air. "He reached out to me, Emily. He said he could help resolve the situation, that I could save you, that there was a way to end it all. And I listened. I wanted to protect you, but now I don't know what to do. They know everything about us. I thought it would be the best way, but now I'm so lost, Emily. They have information. They know where we are. I should have told you sooner, but I thought it would be quick, that there would be no risks." Shock and disbelief took over Emily, and the world around her seemed to stop for a moment. Sarah had done the unthinkable. She had allied with the enemy. Sarah's words felt like a blade cutting through her trust. She never imagined her friend would go this far, that she would fall so deep into Daniel's web of manipulation. She had thrown everything away for an illusion of control. "What did you do?" Emily whispered, her voice low but filled with restrained anger. You worked with him, with his lawyer. How could you do this?" Sarah, visibly shaken, tried to step closer, but Emily took a step back, her gaze cold and fixed. She could barely process the pain she was feeling. The friend she had considered the only person she could trust was now just another piece in Daniel's manipulation. What once seemed like a friendship alliance was now fractured, irreparable. "I thought I was protecting you," Sarah murmured, almost in desperation. "But now I see I was deceived. This isn't what I wanted. I just wanted it to end, for you to be okay." Emily let out a long sigh, feeling the weight of the betrayal crush her chest. She didn't know what to do with the information. She knew deep down she couldn't trust Sarah anymore. She had become too involved with Daniel's methods to continue being her ally. But she also knew that Sarah could still be a key piece in the fight for justice if she could get her head out of the mud and distance herself from the dirty games. As Emily processed everything, a new layer of reality began to form. The threat was no longer just in the anonymous phone calls or the webs of corruption. The threat was within the closest circle she had. The person she trusted most had taken a step into the abyss of betrayal, and that changed everything. But the real blow came shortly after. While Sarah was there, trying to explain her mistake, a phone call interrupted the conversation. It was an anonymous call, but there was something different about it. The voice on the other end was familiar, yet Emily couldn't identify it right away. The person on the line seemed to know intimate details about her life, more than anyone should know, but the revelation hit her like a punch in the stomach. "Emily, you think what you're doing is going to take down Daniel? That's not how things work. Your friend Sarah already gave us everything. She's going to help us do this. Don't worry." The voice on the line seemed to take pleasure in the desperation that Emily felt growing inside her. Emily froze, the phone dropping from her hands, the words echoing in her mind like a sentence. Sarah, her friend, had betrayed her in a way she hadn't imagined. But who was on the other end of the line? Who was really pulling the strings? From that moment on, Emily knew the battle wasn't just about surviving her father anymore. She was facing something much bigger and more threatening than she had ever imagined. Everything had changed in one night, and the truth was that Emily was no longer in control. The phone fell from Emily's hands, and the sound of the impact echoed through the silent room. She stood there motionless, her gaze lost, still processing what she had just heard. Sarah had given everything away, not just her. Daniel's lawyer knew everything. They were in control now, and Emily was lost in a power game she didn't even know how to play. Sarah was paralyzed, unsure of how to react. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, avoiding looking directly at Emily. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out, as if she couldn't articulate anything beyond what she had already said. Emily, however, couldn't afford to be consumed by the pain and anger. The game had changed. She knew that in order to survive, she would need to be more strategic and ruthless than she ever imagined. Her life was now at risk, but there was still a chance to turn things around. The pieces were moving, and she would need to adjust, act more intelligently than ever before. As Emily tried to regain her composure, her mind was racing. Sarah's betrayal wasn't just a personal wound, it was a direct threat to her revenge plan. Sarah's alliance with Daniel's lawyer meant that her information was now in the wrong hands. What else could Sarah have revealed? What else did they know about Emily's investigation? Trust was broken, but Emily had to act fast. "You gave everything away?" Emily's question was cold, more of a statement than a doubt. Sarah looked up, tears in her eyes, but the guilty expression on her face was clear. She slowly shook her head, as if she couldn't believe what she had done. "It wasn't what I wanted. I swear I didn't want this. But they have influence, Emily. They said they could help. I was trying to save you." Sarah's words didn't make sense. She was in shock, but Emily no longer had time to lose herself in emotions. The game was escalating. Daniel's lawyer didn't just have access to Sarah's information, he was also manipulating other pieces of the board. Emily knew that now, and no matter how much Sarah tried to justify her actions, Emily couldn't trust her anymore. The idea of working together, of fighting side by side, no longer made sense. Emily's first reaction was to step away, almost mechanically. She knew she couldn't stay in the same house with Sarah, a constant reminder of the betrayal she was trying to digest. Sarah, now completely beside herself, tried once more to justify her actions, but Emily was already beyond that. She didn't want to hear any more. What mattered was the next step. "I need some time alone, Sarah." Emily's words cut the air like a sharp blade. "You have nothing left to offer." Emily turned and walked to the office where she kept the most valuable information from the investigation. She needed to understand the full extent of the threat now. She needed to prepare. Deep down, she knew there was no going back. The weight of the betrayal and the loss of control was heavy, but it drove her to push further. Now, more than ever, she needed answers. When Emily sat back at the computer and began reviewing the financial records she had found earlier, she noticed a detail she had missed. The name she was investigating, the key to taking down Daniel's network, was more deeply intertwined with political and judicial power than she had imagined. But there was a connection to an even higher name, a name that suggested a global influence. She felt a mix of terror and excitement. Daniel wasn't the end of the story. He was just part of something much bigger, an international network of abuse and corruption, with tentacles reaching all the way to the foundation of the judicial system itself. It was no longer about revenge against her father. It was about destroying an empire of lies, and Emily knew that to do so, she would need to be relentless. But there was a new problem. The person she was starting to identify as the mastermind behind everything was also deeply connected to the authorities and influencers who could destroy any chance of justice for her. As Emily tried to connect the last dots of the network, the phone rang once again. She glanced at the screen. The number was unknown. Without hesitation, she answered, already prepared for more threats. "Emily, do you still think you can do something against us?" The voice on the other end of the line was the same as before, cold, controlled. "You're playing at revenge, but we're playing the real game. And you know what happens to pawns, right?" The man's cold laughter made Emily's stomach churn. He knew she was getting closer to the truth, but he also knew she wasn't alone. He had to get rid of her, or his house of cards would come crashing down. "I've warned you, Emily. If you keep this up, it won't just be your life at risk. It will be everyone you love. Think carefully." A chill ran down Emily's spine. The threat was clear. Revenge was no longer about her father. It was about destroying everyone involved. But at the same time, she knew her own life was about to be destroyed if she didn't make a drastic decision. With Sarah's betrayal still echoing in her mind, Emily felt the weight of the choice before her. She could trust no one anymore. It was just her now. And from that moment on, her only mission would be to destroy the web of corruption, even if it meant losing everything. The weight of Sarah's betrayal was still a burden Emily carried, but it was no longer the center of her life. The pain of losing trust in one of the few people she had believed in was starting to dissipate. The game had changed irreversibly, and she knew there was no more room for hesitation or weakness. The battle was now against a powerful system, a network that involved not just her father, but also prominent figures in legal and political spheres. To destroy them, she would need to be more than the fragile, lost girl she once was. In the following days, Emily focused intensely on reworking her plan. The computer became her ally, and every night she sifted through the database she had compiled, going over every transaction, every name, every connection. She no longer cared about fatigue or fear. Her sole objective was to make Daniel and his network pay, and she was willing to cross any line to make it happen. Throughout the investigation, Emily discovered something crucial. Daniel wasn't just involved in corruption. He was at the helm of a covert operation involving influence peddling and blackmail, using his position and the power of his name to manipulate political, legal, and business decisions. It was an empire built on fear, subjugation, and control. Daniel, with his respectable businessman facade, was not just a criminal. He was the pillar of an international network that crossed borders and corrupted entire systems. Emily didn't know where he was now, but she knew he was hiding, and most importantly, she knew he was desperate. She was getting closer to the truth, and that meant he was starting to realize the risk she posed. She now held the power in her hands, and that made her a threat to be eliminated at all costs. With each step she took, Emily felt stronger, more certain she was on the right path. But she also knew that, in order to continue the fight, she would have to give up some of the last emotional ties that still held her to the past. The old desire for justice, for reconciliation with her father, no longer made sense. He had become a monster. Revenge was no longer something she could feed with morality or pity. She wasn't fighting for redemption anymore. She was fighting to destroy an empire of lies. It was when the tension reached a breaking point that Emily made the hardest decision of her life. She needed to use the only person still within her reach, Sarah. The betrayal had been the first break in trust, but Emily knew that if she used Sarah correctly, she could turn the tables. Sarah knew about Daniel's operations and had crucial information Emily could use to take him down. But that required Emily to expose herself to someone who had irreparably broken her trust. She would have to manipulate Sarah, turn her against her own father, using the information Sarah had handed over to Daniel's lawyer against him. However, Emily was no longer the scared young woman who had felt powerless before her father. She didn't hesitate. She knew what she needed to do. She went to Sarah, determined to use her vulnerability to her advantage. Sarah was in an even worse situation than Emily had imagined. Daniel knew she was trying to distance herself from him, and he was using emotional manipulation to trap her. But Emily, with her plan already in place, was direct and relentless. "You know what you need to do, Sarah," Emily said, looking directly into her former friend's eyes. "There's no time for regrets anymore. If you want this to end, you need to put Daniel in his place." Sarah seemed lost, but there was a spark of desperation in her eyes, as if she knew she was trapped in a web she could no longer untangle. I can't do this, Emily. I'm not that kind of person. I can't." She started to stammer, but Emily interrupted her. "You've already done it, Sarah." Emily's voice was cold, no room for weakness. "Now, use it to destroy what you helped build. There's no going back. You'll help me take him down, or you'll see what happens to you." Emily's words sounded like a death sentence, and Sarah, though still reluctant, knew she had no choice. She was in Emily's hands now, and for her own survival, she would have to do whatever was necessary. At that moment, something changed. Sarah was willing to cooperate, but the sense of control over the situation was no longer in her hands. Emily now dominated the game, and the transformation of her vulnerability into strength was evident. She was no longer a victim. She was a warrior, ready to destroy whatever was necessary to bring justice. One night, Emily accessed the last information she had gathered and saw the opportunity unfold before her. The final piece of the puzzle was there, on the computer screen. A secret meeting between Daniel and other members of his empire, scheduled to take place in the city. Emily knew this was the moment. She now had everything she needed to expose Daniel and his network to the world. But she also knew it would be dangerous. This could be her last chance, and she was willing to do whatever it took. The decision was made. Emily was ready. She had overcome her own weaknesses, and now there was no turning back. Her revenge would begin there. The room was dark, except for the pale light from the computer screen. Emily sat in front of it, analyzing the last file, a confidential recording of a meeting Daniel was having with other members of his criminal network. The conversation was crucial, and she knew it. It was the final proof, the missing link that would connect Daniel and his operation to the corruption and crimes he had committed, not only within his own family, but also in political and business circles. She had what she needed. A clear video of his meeting with an influential judge, discussing bribes, manipulating cases, and even extortion involving prominent government figures. But she knew exposing him wouldn't be simple. Daniel and his allies were well protected, and the chance of failing at such a moment could cost her more than her life. Sarah, still hesitant, had finally given in. Emily's threats had dug deep into her psyche, and her collaboration, though forced, had become the key to the final step of Emily's plan. Together, they had tracked Daniel's every move, and now he was about to be unmasked. Yet as Emily felt she was getting closer to her goal, the weight of the responsibility she carried was becoming almost unbearable. She knew her final move would be more than just an attack on Daniel. The choice to expose the network of corruption would have a much greater impact, affecting the lives of many people. She turned off the computer and for a moment sat still. The silence of the night filled the room. It was now or never. There was no more room for fear or hesitation. Every decision she had made up to that point had led her here, but more than that, Emily now understood what was at stake: her own transformation. She was no longer her father's victim. She was no longer the desperate daughter seeking justice. She was a relentless woman, ready to destroy an empire of corruption. But more than ever, she needed to be strategic and cautious. Emily's phone vibrated frequently, but she didn't answer it. The calls were from Daniel's lawyer, and she already knew what he wanted: attempts to dissuade her, to threaten her into backing down. But there was no more room for manipulation. She wouldn't be controlled anymore. She wouldn't be intimidated. She looked out the window. The city outside seemed calm, but Emily knew chaos was about to unfold. She had planned every move, calculated every risk. The next stage of her revenge would be the most dangerous of all. The meeting was set for the following night, in a secluded building on the outskirts of the city, a place Daniel used for his secret meetings. Emily knew that was where the final piece of the puzzle would fall into place. But she wouldn't go alone. She would need the help of someone she had initially lost all trust in: Sarah. Sarah, as if sensing the end was near, showed up at Emily's house in the morning, nervous but ready to cooperate. She had decided that if she was going to destroy Daniel, she would also destroy her own complicity with him. Emily knew this couldn't just be about personal revenge. It had to be a bigger battle against the system, against the figures who held power in the shadows. And for that, Sarah would be her final ally. "Are you ready to end this?" Emily asked, her voice cold, reflecting her emotional state. Sarah seemed frightened, but her gaze didn't waver. She had surrendered to guilt, and now, standing beside Emily, she felt a pressure that was almost unbearable. It was a fight for survival for both of them. There was no room for hesitation anymore. "I have to do this, Emily," Sarah murmured, fear evident on her face. "I know I can't go back, but Daniel needs to pay. Not just for everything he did to you, but for everything he did to my life too." Emily nodded. She knew Sarah had her own demons, but what mattered now was the greater goal. They were united for a common end. The plan was in place. The night before the big confrontation, Emily gathered everything she needed: the recording of the meeting, Daniel's contact list, documents compromising several government members, and the lawyers in the criminal network. Every piece was in its place. She mentally prepared herself for what was to come, knowing that the only way to ensure her survival was to expose everything. The plan was simple: go in, expose the meeting, and leave. But the reality of putting this into practice made her even more alert. The clock showed it was time to leave. Emily put on simple, practical clothes, enough to disguise herself so she wouldn't be recognized, yet still able to move quickly. Beside Sarah, she drove to the designated location, the isolated building in a forgotten corner of the city. The streetlights began to flicker off as they got closer, and the tension in the air only grew stronger. In the car, the silence between them was heavy. They both knew that any mistake would be fatal. Daniel wasn't just a corrupt man. He was now in a position of desperation, trying to protect his network at all costs. This would be Emily's final move. Before getting out of the car, Emily turned to Sarah. Her eyes were steady, without fear, without regret. "We're ending this," Emily said, her voice a mixture of determination and coldness. Sarah took a deep breath, an almost automatic gesture, trying to calm herself. They were about to take the last step. The door to the building was slightly ajar, and Emily entered without hesitation. The final confrontation was about to begin. The building was completely silent, with only the dim light from flickering lamps providing illumination. Emily and Sarah walked through the main entrance, where an oppressive atmosphere seemed to swallow every step they took. They were in the heart of Daniel's empire, and every second there was a gamble. If something went wrong, it would all be over. They knew that. Emily looked at Sarah, who still appeared nervous, but determined. Nothing could stop them now. Every move had been carefully planned, and the recording of the meeting was the key piece they needed to bring down Daniel. But what they didn't know was that by stepping in, they were preparing for something far bigger than just a confrontation with the man who had destroyed their lives. They reached the main hall of the building, a large, empty room, except for a few shadows moving at the edges. Emily pulled out her phone and sent the final message to her source, confirming the time of the meeting. A short, simple reply appeared on the screen. "We're ready to expose." Oh, the feeling of being on the front lines had never been more real. Emily knew that by sending that message, the clock would start ticking. There was only one chance to take down Daniel and his network of criminals. No mistakes could be made. They walked to the end of the hallway and reached a heavy security door. Emily signaled to Sarah, who began typing a code into the panel. When the door opened, the secret room appeared before them. The environment was opulent and dark, with large chairs and marble tables, a room decorated with the immense luxury that only people with absolute power could flaunt. There, at a central table, sat Daniel's men, the judge, the corrupt politician, and other powerful allies of the network. They were having a seemingly calm conversation, unaware that they were about to lose everything. Daniel was there too, at the back of the room, with his usual expression, cold, controlled, and manipulative. Emily didn't hesitate. She was ready to expose everything. As Sarah positioned herself at the entrance of the room, Emily walked straight to one of the side tables where a computer was set up. Quickly, she connected her device and projected the recording onto the large monitor dominating the glass wall. The footage showed Daniel and his accomplices discussing illegal deals, bribes, and blackmail. The silence in the room was deafening. All the men in the room were frozen, unable to believe what they were seeing. The evidence was laid bare. The corruption and crime were there, recorded for the world to see. Daniel, realizing what was happening, abruptly stood up from his chair. You can't do this!" he shouted, his voice filled with rage. "You don't know what you're doing!" Emily didn't move. She stared at him with an unyielding look. Every word he spoke only strengthened her resolve. She no longer feared her father. The man she once wanted to save was lost, trapped in the web of his own corruption. "I know exactly what I'm doing, Dad." Emily's voice came out firm and decisive, no longer laden with fear or frustration. She was in control now. "It's over, and I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done." Daniel's allies began to move, some trying to reach for their weapons, others hastily talking on their phones, trying to erase any trace of what had just happened. But Emily was already one step ahead. She pressed a button on the remote and the doors automatically closed, locking everyone inside the room. Panic spread quickly. Daniel tried to approach Emily, his eyes full of hatred, but she was ready. She knew he would try something, knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. Emily had anticipated every move, every word, and when Daniel came closer, she raised her hand and revealed what she had been hiding. A recorder that contained everything he had said in private over the past few months. Not just the meeting that had just been exposed, but also previous transactions, blackmail conversations, and threats involving influential people, all recorded, all ready to be sent to the media and authorities. "Your friends already know what's going on, Daniel," Emily said, smiling with a coldness she never imagined feeling. "What happens next is up to you." The tension in the room was palpable. Daniel, now with no way out, tried to retreat, but what lay behind his facade of power was no longer enough. He stood naked before all his sins. As he tried to control his nerves, Emily made her final move. With Sarah's help, who had positioned herself strategically, Emily activated an emergency device that sent the recording and files directly to local newspapers, the FBI, and even international news networks. The information began spreading instantly. Daniel looked at her, his eyes burning with hatred, but also with the inevitable realization he had been defeated. His network was collapsing and he was about to be exposed to the world. Emily's revenge was complete. However, before anything else could happen, a sound of an explosion echoed from the back of the room. Emily didn't have time to process what was going on. Something had been triggered, and the room started shaking. Daniel had played his last card, a desperate attempt to eliminate any evidence, to destroy the room, to take everyone down with him. But there was no time for regrets. The end was near, and Emily was no longer willing to give in. The impact of the explosion reverberated through the room, and Emily felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. Smoke and dust began filling the air, making the atmosphere dense and almost unbearable. At first, she wasn't sure if the shock was caused by a self-destruct device Daniel had activated, or if the reaction was just a consequence of the ongoing struggle. Time seemed to stretch, as if each second passed more slowly than it should have. Sarah screamed, frantic, trying to pull her away from the epicenter of the explosion, but Emily didn't move. She was paralyzed, watching everything unfold like a specter, a distant observer of a reality too cruel to bear. Her eyes fixed on Daniel, who was lying on the floor, his face bloody, an expression of despair etched on his face. He was trying to crawl away, but couldn't lift himself. The weight of defeat was crushing him. The final part of the plan had been executed with precision. The recording, the files, the evidence of his involvement in the biggest corruption schemes. It was all now in the hands of the authorities. The vast criminal network he had woven was disintegrating before his very eyes. But as the adrenaline faded, Emily felt that deep down, the sense of victory wasn't complete. It was as if something was missing, as if the revenge had been bitter and unfinished. "It's over, Dad." Emily's voice was hollow, but without regret. It was a declaration of an end, not just for Daniel, but for all the pain he had caused. She no longer needed his approval. She no longer needed his presence. Sarah once again pulled her away from the danger zone. Her eyes now also filled with fear, but with a look of relief. They needed to get out before the authorities arrived. The sirens were already audible in the distance, and chaos was about to take over the building. It wasn't safe to stay there, and they knew Daniel and the others in the network would be hunted down. But as Emily finally stepped away, she felt that the weight of justice didn't bring the satisfaction she had imagined. The victory had come at a cost, and she knew the scars left by her journey wouldn't disappear easily. She didn't feel completely free, but she knew that somehow she was now in control of her own life. What would happen next was a new chapter. She didn't know if peace would ever come, but for now she had only one certainty: revenge had been fulfilled, and Daniel was paying the price for everything he had done. At the hospital, Sarah's treatment was relatively simple, but the emotional pain was visible. The memories of her betrayal, of her own involvement in the crimes, mixed with the idea of a new life. She felt free, but also lost, not knowing which path to take from this moment on. Emily, on the other hand, offered no consolation. She knew her own journey had just begun. The world now knew everything Daniel had done. His allies were arrested, his influence undone. There was no more escaping. But Emily's scars were deeper than any prison. The revenge she had sought so badly hadn't given her the peace she longed for. As Emily left the hospital, she looked up at the night sky. The stars were visible, but there was something empty in her view. She didn't know if that emptiness would ever be filled, or if it would be a constant shadow reminding her of everything she had lost along the way. But in that moment, Emily didn't feel anger. She only felt that finally she was free. Not from Daniel, but from what he represented, the power he had used to destroy her, to erode her soul. And that, at least, was over. As she walked alone through the deserted streets, the police sirens in the distance and the sound of helicopters overhead, she realized something she had never imagined. Revenge, though accomplished, hadn't made her stronger. It had transformed her into someone who could never turn back, someone who would now live with the consequences of her choices. But maybe That was what true freedom meant. Months passed since that confrontation. Daniel was in prison and his corruption network had collapsed. Emily, now off the radar of the press, had rebuilt her life in a new city, far from those shadows. But the truth was etched into her soul, and she knew she would never be the same. Some say revenge is sweet, but Emily had learned that it is a burden, a permanent mark. Now, she sought more than just justice. She sought redemption. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She would never allow the past to define her. And you, what would you do if you had to choose between revenge and redemption? Emily found freedom, but at a huge cost. Each decision, each step she took moved her farther from what she knew, but also brought her closer to who she truly wanted to be. Revenge is a one-way path, and no matter how justice is served, it leaves its scars. What do you think she learned in the end? Share your thoughts and help spread the reflection on the impact of the choices we make in our lives.